My name is Carl Quo, and this is Founder Quest, a podcast about the journeys of starting a game studio. Welcome back to Founders Quest for 2025. We're kicking off the year with a conversation with Heather Cerlan, founder of NEARstudios. Heather has a remarkable track record of work in the AAA space, including Naughty Dog, Bethesda, and EA. Yet, she has also had a desire to start her own studio for much of that career, and she nurtured and prepared for that along the way. I found Heather's journey to be remarkable in both its twists and turns, but also her resilience in the face of that. I hope you find our conversation as inspiring as I did. Let's jump in. So, what I always like to start with is there was this moment where you were like, I'm starting a studio, right? I'm going down this path. I'm founding a company. And that moment's always so interesting to me because like everyone approaches it differently. Everyone gets there in a different way. So talk to me about what was the lead up to that moment and that decision and what really tipped you over the edge.
Yeah, so it started for me. I kind of contribute this as like the spark, and this was during my time at Naughty Dog. I was a texture artist working on. I had just wrapped up The Last of Us, the PS3 version, so this was like 2013 timeframe, and I was still very new at Naughty Dog. I'd been there probably maybe like a little over a year or so, and maybe closer to a year and a half. And I had a friend of mine that was, I believe she was like lead character concept artist or something at the time. She came over to me and was like, "Oh, Neil Druckmann, who's the creative director on The Last of Us, was talking about wanting to catch up with you, so he might swing by and ask you if you want to chat with him about the game." I was like, "Oh, cool, okay, yeah, I'm game." And so a little bit later, Neil had come by and asked if, I'd be interested in grabbing lunch. He's like, he's like, I'm essentially, thinking about the DLC for The Last of Us. It was what came and shipped as Last of Us Left Behind. And he's like, from what I understand, you identify as a lesbian, and there's, some of the prequel story for Ellie. I wanted to, introduce her as essentially a queer character. And so I would be, wondering if you wanted to share some of your experience, just any of your life experience, so that I can kind of use that as like a way to inspire, to like write the characters and make it feel like it's authentic. So obviously I was like thrilled at that opportunity. And so a few of us went to lunch, including the character artist, Ashley. And there was another concept. I think she was like helping us with UX related stuff. So there was like 3 or 4 of us out to lunch. And Neil just kind of went through the storyline and what he was thinking, and basically, said that he would love to like do a deeper dive with me on kind of just my story, like my coming of age story, and my any inspiration that I grew up with, or if there was any books or shows or movies that portrayed lesbian characters in ways that I felt were positive. And ultimately, there was several months where we just kind of had casual conversations about my story. Like I grew up essentially being gay, but not really knowing what the word was for it for the longest time, for as long as I can remember. So I kind of just shared my story with him, and then shared some inspiration. I mean, at the time, there wasn't really a lot of like positive representations of lesbian characters in games. So uh, I struggled to actually come up with a few that were like positive. And actually, one of the ones that I came up with that I felt like portrayed the like dynamic between the two characters that I felt like would be appropriate was this movie called Fried Green Tomatoes. And so we, I told them that like that was a really great reference for that kind of subtlety of like, are they interested in each other? Like you're not really sure. Like if you weren't looking for it, you wouldn't really know that it was happening until like, spoiler alert, at the end of the DLC, um, Ellie and the secondary character Riley end up kissing, and so it ends up being like a surprise for a lot of people. But for women that, queer women, they kind of like picked up on it a little bit earlier, and they were like, no, there's no, maybe I'm imagining it. And so you don't really know, maybe they're just friends. Like you kind of question that. And that's a very authentic experience, especially from my perspective growing up in the 90s, the like in the 90s and early 2000s, being queer and like not really being able to talk about it. And so that was just like a really cool experience. I was able to help out with giving some feedback on um, the like auditions for Riley, and a little bit of the character dialogue, and just some of the kind of moment to moment aspects of the game. And so that was really cool. Like I, as an artist, I was kind of always on this trajectory in my career as like, oh, one day I'll be an art director, and I didn't really think past that. But after that experience, I was like, wow, that was like really cool to kind of get that behind the scenes, hands on look at like essentially being a creative director. And so I was like, man, maybe I want to be a creative director one day. It was this very abstract thing. At the time, Naughty Dog was my like dream company, and I was like over the moon to be working there. And so, and in my head, I thought I was going to be at Naughty Dog forever. Like that was my dream job. I was going to retire there. I was fully convinced of that. So I, it's like really funny thinking back on this. Like I thought to myself, like, oh, okay, I want to be creative director, but who am I kidding? I'm never going to be creative director at Naughty Dog. Like at the time, none of the directors or leads had left. They've been there for like 20 plus years. And so in my head, I was like, it's easier for me to just start a company. Like I'll just have to start a company one day and I'll get to be creative director that way. And so it was just this very kind of like passing thought. And then over the years, like leading towards the like tail end of my time at Naughty Dog, I kept thinking about it more and more. And then kind of like, then it just kind of like became a bit of an obsession. And I was like, okay, I think I like really actually want to start a company. I got to figure out what it is I want to like. How do I get there? What do I need to do to kind of prepare myself? And so I went through a little bit of like, especially at the tail end of my time at Naughty Dog, I was like going through a little bit of a career crisis because I was like, well, should I change my career path? Should I like leave the industry and go to business school? Should I, I was just like all the options I was thinking about. And I ultimately landed on I'm just going to like, instead of spending my spare time perfecting my craft as an artist, I'm going to instead read business books and just kind of immerse myself in as much material as I can to try to learn the business side of things. Because I knew as an artist, I'm like, I don't have like the business acumen. I don't have that experience. I don't feel comfortable with it yet. So I need to like figure it out. And so I spent, years and years, like, I mean, this was probably like 2015, 2016 in earnest that I was like, okay, I'm going to do this. I actually bought the domain name for NEARstudios back in 2016. So I was pretty serious about it at that point in time. And I went through this whole journey of like thinking about the branding for the company and just, trying to absorb and prepare myself as much as possible, whatever that means. So that I kind of I like very specifically remember that point of like, oh, I'll just have to start a company one day in this kind of casual casual way.
And here you are.
Yep, here I am.
So like that really started the spark, and I think uh I do find it interesting because I think artists especially are not the most common founder path, and in some ways I think precisely to sort of that tension that you point out of like many times what artists are incentivized to do both by their community, by job stuff, by art school maybe, right? Like is that like, oh, let me spend my spare time working on art, right? And maybe it's art for myself, or maybe it's perfecting my craft or whatever, but it often doesn't leave a lot of time for outside of that discipline expansion, right? And to your point, business learning how to run a business is usually outside of everyone's discipline in the game industry. Um, and so I think it's really cool how you got there. But let's fast forward a little bit of like you spent a bunch of time researching this stuff. You continued on your career and also worked as an artist at a bunch of other places. What was the tipping point that said, okay, I am sufficiently ready, question mark, to incorporate and start this journey, right?
Yeah. I don't. Yeah. I feel like it took many years to get there. So when I left Naughty Dog, and that was purely out of um, needing to move back to the East Coast. So the deal with my spouse when we moved out to the West Coast was whenever she's ready to move back, because all of her family is in Maryland, and so the deal was I'll move out there with you under one condition, like whenever I'm ready to move back, and if we're like still together, but we weren't married at the time, we were just like dating. Um, you know, when I'm like ready to move back to be like closer to family and settle down, I would ask that you come with me. And so that was the deal, like going into it. And I knew that from the get go. There was always kind of this part of me that wished that she would fall so much in love with LA, and we did. We loved LA. We both really enjoyed our time out there, but we got to the point where we realized we weren't really going to be able to afford a house, and we wanted to settle down and start a family, and we knew that we weren't going to be able to like really do that in LA. So it was a combination of like honestly the crunch at Naughty Dog was really bad. The Lost Legacy game that shipped was like a particularly bad crunch for me. And she was just like kind of over it and ready to go. She's like, I think it's time, because I got pretty burnt out by the end of Lost Legacy. And so, but there was this part of me, because I knew, Neil Druckmann had done the pitch for the entire studio for Last of Us 2, and I really like, and that was like at the tail end of like the development for Lost Legacy, and I didn't have the mental capacity to kind of like process the pitch for Last of Us 2, but I knew that there was stuff on the like LGBTQ themes that I wanted to talk to Neil about, so I like convinced my wife to stay. I was like, can I like work on the Last of Us 2 for like a year? And so that was the like agreement that we made, and so I did that and was able to kind of express some of my thoughts on the narrative for Last of Us 2. And then by the time we were ready to move back, to Maryland, I ended up taking a role at Bethesda as a senior artist. But I was really brought on to like help them build out new technology for their engine. So they were in the process of like building a new renderer for their Creation Engine 2. So they were creating Creation Engine 2. They wanted to update all the tech for it, and so I was responsible for kind of putting together a team and building the design of their layered material system. Uh, for the first like 2 years or so that I was there, and essentially training the entire art team across the like three studios. There was the Rockville, the original studio, Rockville, Maryland studio. Then there's Dallas, Austin. Oh, sorry, four, Montreal. So there were a bunch of studios that had artists there, and all of them were going to be using Creation Engine 2 in this new layered material system. So I had to, kind of train the entire art team across those studios on how to use the new workflows and the new tools that I essentially was the only one in the company that had experience with layered materials. So trying to explain that to I'm fairly technical as well. Like I taught myself how to program during my tail end time at Naughty Dog, purely just from like a tech art, like wanting to build tools that made me more efficient. So I started in Python and then ended up learning C# because I was playing around in Unity a little bit. And so I was technical enough and couldn't communicate. And I ultimately, that was the big reason for doing it, was being able, like knowing I'm going to start a company, I want to be able to communicate with engineers. So that was a really good experience working with a large team. There was like, I think at some point there were about 17 different engineers that kind of rotated on and off the project across like systems, rendering, UI like tools, um, across all these different systems for the game, and so or for the editor. And it was a really cool experience. It was very, very hard. This was a studio that like was so used to doing things for so long that like it it was, and we were also developing Starfield at the same time, so it was very challenging. But I feel like it really prepared me for the next step of my career, or like it got me closer to feeling comfortable with starting a company. So my time there, like going from Naughty Dog to Bethesda, was this like stark like culture shock. To be honest, they're very, very different studios. They're both very successful studios, great studios in their own right, but very different approaches and philosophy and cultures. And so I that was my time at Bethesda was really the time where I started becoming obsessive over the idea of like starting a company. And it really all centered around the idea of like building a culture and like a good production philosophy around making games. Going from Naughty Dog where they're like super, super focused on polish and like high fidelity. It's like ingrained in the culture there. So it's like, they specifically bring on people that are like compulsive and constantly want to like perfect their craft, which is great because you get to work with some really, really talented people. But from my time at Bethesda, it kind of taught me that there is like a diminishing return on investment. Of course, like you're also, I'm reading business books at the same time. So I'm kind of putting all these different concepts and ideas together. And at a certain point, it was like going to Bethesda, they're like quantity over quality. And oftentimes they're just kind of like, okay, good enough, moving on. And you're like, I don't know. No, this is not good enough. And you're like, well, it is what it is, and I had to kind of get used to that and develop a little bit of a muscle for it and become comfortable. So I think that also is serving us really well as a startup right now, having to just be like scrappy and move forward and be like, so it has really kind of helped inform my like, kind of approach with making games. And then, reading tons of business books. And then the pandemic hits. Because my biggest concern about trying to start a company was, Bethesda was having a hard time trying to hire talent to come out to Maryland because they were very like particular about wanting, people on site. And this was, pre-pandemic. So I was thinking to myself, like, how the hell am I going to start a company? Like nobody, if like Bethesda can't hire talent to come out, like who the hell is going to like move to start a company with me, or even like try to develop a game with me. So it felt like this far-fetched dream. I didn't really have like a time frame for it. But then when the pandemic hit and remote work became a possibility, I was like, oh, okay, this is awesome. And then at a certain point, when the Microsoft acquisition happened, and I had just wrapped up the layered material work, and I like knew I wanted to leave to go like work at startups if it was a possibility, because I wanted that experience of being able to build everything from the ground up, a team process, and I got to do that. So I left Bethesda, went to Archetype Entertainment, which is a well-funded startup. They're funded by Wizards of the Coast / Hasbro, and got to feel what it was like working with vanilla Unreal and, helping to build up an art team and coming up with process and pipeline for the game. And I was already familiar with look dev, like, rapid prototyping. I did a lot of that at Naughty Dog. I was often kind of one of the first, teams to be brought in to like prototype one of the earlier levels pretty much on almost every project. Not the look dev stuff, but like, okay, gameplay is coming in and now we need to like prototype stuff. So that was already like a comfortable thing for me. And the way that Naughty Dog worked, they allowed a lot of autonomy. So they didn't have producers for the longest time at the studio. For the entire time I was there weren't producers. So you were kind of trusted to just work collaboratively with your group, and you were the only person doing that discipline. So like there was no like you had to get the work done in order to like unblock the team and like let progress happen. So it was really empowering, but it also, if you're not used to that, it can be pretty intimidating at first. But luckily I really enjoyed it. So I feel like that prepared me really well for like the time at the startup. And then they weren't a remote like only studio. In fact, they were building out a physical location and wanted people to be at the Austin studio. So I figured long term that wasn't going to work out. And then Amy Henning, I got in touch with Amy Henning from Naughty Dog, who was creative director on Last of Us, or sorry, not Last of Us, the Uncharted series. They were looking for a lead artist, and I was like, absolutely, like I would love to work with you again. And it was a bunch of folks from Naughty Dog that had left and went to join Amy, and they were working on the Marvel title that was with Captain America and Black Panther, and we were doing a lot of look dev and kind of the similar thing. Basically, everything I did at Archetype, I was helping to do there. I was only there for about 8 months, and I kept getting this sense that like, there were a lot of startups spinning up, venture capital poured in. I had studied kind of the history of venture capital, and I had studied the like structure of venture capital, and so I understood a lot about it. I had also built up a lot of connections in venture capital as well over the years, and so at a certain point I was like, okay, I see these startups spinning up, I don't feel super ready, but like I kind of just get this feeling that like you never feel ready, you just got to make the leap. And then I also was seeing the window closing for investment, because I knew enough about macroeconomics. My first my first girlfriend worked in finance and economics, so I knew enough about kind of how the cycles work. And I was like, okay, if I don't jump now, like I might miss the window to get funding. So I jumped off, and it was just me by myself. And so it was just a kind of a combination of like knowing enough, seeing the opportunity, and then just kind of like, I don't know, going for it, essentially, which was a very scary, scary moment when you finally decide to pull the trigger on it. So yeah, that was a long-winded way of, telling that story, but yeah.
No, no worries. So you decide you're gonna jump. No one's ever ready, but so we're gonna jump when we're not ready.
Hmm.
As the saying goes, do it scared. What I like to ask is like it, you've done a bunch of prep work, you've read a bunch about business and studied up on that on the side. You've had all these experiences, including ones at startups that sort of prepare you for that moment, and then you do it. And then what's the biggest thing that you're like, oh no, now I have to learn to do this? I was so prepared, but this is the thing I'm unprepared for. What's the big thing that you're like, oh, I had to go and learn this?
Oh my gosh, there's no like big thing. It's just like a series of a lot of little things that are like, you might kind of have a very high level understanding, but when you got to actually jump into the weeds and like get your hands dirty, those are the little, like all the little moments, right? Like you can kind of conceptually understand certain things, but it's until you actually get in there and start doing it, it's a constant journey of learning. Like I don't think I can't point to any one particular thing that's like, oh no, I didn't know this. It's just like the details of all the things you don't really know until you start doing it.
Yeah. So when you jumped, it was just you. Is that sort of like how you ended up, like is that sort of how the form of the company is now, where you are the sort of like on paper the solo founder, and then you've built out a team? Or did you end up going on a journey to find co-founders? Or talk to me a little bit about how that sort of manifested.
Yeah, so I spent the first 6 months. I always wanted co-founders,
Hmm.
because I'd listened to enough podcasts and read enough books to know that like being a solo founder is really hard. It's a lonely journey. I'm a pretty like social person. I'm very collaborative. I wanted to have somebody else there to kind of like share in the journey of that. So I knew from the get go I wanted co-founders. I initially um, jumped off thinking I would find two other co-founders to join me, so a design co-founder and a technical co-founder. And I started first looking for technical co-founders, and I actually ended up finding a technical co-founder very early on. This was so I started the company in, let's see, I want to say it was July of 2022, and then by October, I want to say it was October, I had a co-founder that it was a, I mean, he was a a platform engineer, a senior or principal platform engineer at Riot Games. I actually met him at a A16Z Games Fun One like networking event in LA. So like I I remember going around. I specifically went to that to like meet the partners in person because I already knew of them, and I actually had contact with one of the partners there, and essentially tried to like figure out a way to get an invite to this because it was invite only. And luckily, it worked out for me to attend this event, and I ended up talking to a bunch of the partners there, and then I was just kind of like, okay, it's coming towards the tail end of that networking event, and I was kind of like socially exhausted, and I was like, all right, because everybody's there to talk to the partners and any of the like A16Z staff. So at a certain point, I just saw this person standing over kind of to the side by himself, and I was like, oh, okay, that's an easy, because everybody's in groups, and it's hard to kind of just like angle in to like start a conversation if people are in circles. So I was like, okay, I'm just gonna go and talk to this person. Turns out he's a platform, or was a platform engineer at Riot, and he was looking for either to start his own thing or to join people. And I was like, perfect. I'm looking to like put something together. Let's chat. So over several months, we had a lot of conversations. He agreed to join, but we hadn't signed anything at that point in time. Like we both agreed, like let's wait till we get a little bit closer to like it looking like we would get funding. And so we ended up working together. We were looking for a design co-founder. I was in conversations with a lot of different design, folks that were in leadership roles across AAA studios. Um, there was a lead designer from Epic that the conversations I'd kind of been talking to this person for quite a while, probably like almost that entire 6 months, and we finally convinced them to join the journey as well. So they were like, well, I need to leave Epic, but in order to leave Epic, I need to be able to sell my shares. And so we were kind of waiting. Like he couldn't commit. He's like, I do want to do this, but I have to get rid of my shares, and I can't commit until like I do that. So we were kind of like tentatively waiting to like see if he was going to be able to join. But we were kind of moving forward in like in ideation phase, and then eventually, like within a couple weeks, we ended up hitting this snag where the like platform engineer decided that they wanted to essentially like make a mobile first studio. And I had already had this whole pitch for the company. Like I knew exactly the type of company I wanted to build. Like, I we talked about that. He agreed to that. So when he did this like 180, we were like, wait a second, what? This is like not what we had discussed. Like, talk me through it, like what you're thinking. And so we had a lot of conversations about it. And we had, at the time we had like mobile ambitions, but we didn't want to be a like mobile first studio. So we ultimately, through a lot of conversations and heart to hearts, we realized like, okay, we're not aligned on quite a bit there. So like, this isn't. I mean, we knew like he was very like savvy on the business side as well, so he knew that like ultimately this wasn't going to work out. So it was very amicable. We were like, okay, well, wish you the best. Like, hopefully we can work together in some capacity in the future, and just kind of left it at that. And then I kind of waited around for a couple months to see if this lead designer was able to get rid of stock. This was in like March, April, May timeframe of 2023, and this was interest rates had just gone up. Stock market was in free fall. He could not get rid of his shares. He kept trying. I mean, he had been trying to get rid of his shares for like maybe 4 months before I even like reached out to him. So he'd been trying for a while. And unfortunately, the timing just didn't work out. I gave him kind of like a deadline, like, by the end of May, if you're not able to get rid of your stock, like I need a co-founder who can commit, because I need to get out there and start fundraising like months ago because I knew that the window was closing. And so unfortunately the timing didn't work out. So I was back kind of to square one. During that whole process, I also had gone through a very tragic personal journey. I had lost my son earlier that year, and so I was dealing with grief. I had just lost the two co-founders that I'd spent 6 months trying to put together, and I came to this critical point of like, oh my gosh, I have to like basically what felt like starting over again. And it was a struggle, but I had to keep pushing forward. I couldn't imagine not doing the company, and so I honestly probably just like poured my grief into the company. If I'm being like truly honest, I wasn't like processing it in a very healthy way, but it was kind of what got me through that moment. And so I actually ended up getting around that, around the time that I was talking early days to like it started, congealing into a more like serious consideration with the lead designer from Epic. I got in touch with one of my old colleagues from Bethesda. And at the time, the hardest thing was just trying to convince people to jump off and, like leave their AAA jobs and do this risky thing. He was already in the mindset of wanting to start a company. And I was like, perfect. Okay. I don't have to like try to convince you of that. That's great. Um, so we jumped right into the game. Like I had put together a game pitch, but it was never about the game for me when I like started the company. I always thought this is just something to like rally a team around. And if like the design co-founder wants to do something different, they're the design expert. I'm going to trust them. We can figure something else out. So I pitched the game. It was something that I was telling people like I hadn't seen something like this before, like from a like blending these different features and genres together. So when I pitched it to him, he was like, "Whoa, this is weird. Like this is very similar to like a game concept I've been kind of kicking around in my head for a while." Um, and so we talked more about that, and I was like, "Okay, well, share your pitch." And it turned out like we systemically had kind of the same game. The one that I was pitching was significantly like bigger in scope, and his was like much smaller. Obviously, we had different IPs, but like overall, the type of game we wanted to make was like very aligned. And then we started talking about like um, why do like how did you come to this conclusion that you wanted to make this type of game? And the more we talked about it, we realized like, oh wow, we have very similar stories. Like essentially, we wanted to make games that allowed uh, us to sit there and play games with either our families or our significant others, and there would be like mechanics and things to do in the game that each of us would enjoy. Like my wife is more of a cozy gamer. I tend to be more of like a hardcore core gamer, and he has a very similar makeup in his family as well, and he also has like a teenager son. So like they all play together, and there's just not like a lot of games out there that allow these different play styles to kind of come together and feel like they're all getting what they want out of the game. And so that's what kind of like inspired him. That's what inspired me, kind of separately in our own journeys. And so we ultimately were like, wow, okay, we want to make the same game for the same audience for the same reason. Like clearly we need to work together. And we're already familiar with each other from like our time at Bethesda. So it clicked and we were just like, all right, let's do this, And yeah, so that's Jason Richardson, who's my co-founder, and he's game director on our game Hawthorn.
Awesome. One of the things that I think is really interesting so far about your journey is um, when I've talked to a lot of founders, it often is like I call it co-founder dating, but co-founder dating often starts with sort of your immediate network and that kind of stuff, and that's where you ended up, right? But I think you sort of shared this journey where you ended up meeting folks who were pretty outside of your network and actually got pretty far in conversations with them, right? And whenever you're co-founder dating, it's unfortunately a lot like real dating in that like all of those, you end up talking to a lot of people and it may go a little bit further, but it's such a big step on a journey that like finding that right alignment takes time. um I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about the time when you met the platform engineer, you met the epic designer, sort of like take me a little bit through how you thought about that let me go out, discover co-founders. I've landed on I need an engineering and a design partner. Okay, now how do I try to like play the numbers game of meeting the people and having the conversations and doing that sort of dating exercise? Like, how did you approach that?
I had a very, I would say, like kind of a formal process in the beginning, um, and it went to show how well that worked out, right? So I had this whole series of questions that I felt were like appropriate questions to ask potential candidates for co-founder, and went through those questions. And there are a lot of questions that I had pulled from all these resources that are kind of the stereotypical questions you would ask to kind of understand their values and their kind of understanding what type of company they could see this becoming. Like, here's where it starts. Are you comfortable with all the kind of scrappy stuff that comes with that? Like, do you have the financial means to like do this for a while? Kind of having those conversations, figuring that out, trying to figure out, you know, where could they see this company going? How comfortable are they with this expanding or this, kind of just like doing these exercises of like imagining what it can become and making sure you're aligned on that, and just talking through all these scenarios that could potentially happen. Like, what would you do in a scenario where there's like an acquisition offer, and what you're thinking around that? Like, at what point would you be willing to to sell the company? Do you want to, all these questions about them as individuals, their values, their personal circumstances, to like their goals and hopes and dreams for the for the company and for the project, um, going forward. And just kind of trying to imagine all these different scenarios and talk about it so that you can kind of anticipate it if it ever becomes a thing that you have to discuss in the future. You're not completely caught off guard. Like, and I had that process, so it's kind of crazy that it didn't. I mean, well, to be honest, the first platform engineer, I would say it wasn't being like, um, I think that they were like, I don't think that they weren't like telling me certain information. I think they were looking at the changing climate in the industry and kind of trying to assess what they thought was going to be the best like strategic move to make a successful company. And they were very much more in the mindset of like kind of the serial entrepreneur. So like, raising venture capital, building a high growth company, selling it, taking the proceeds of that, doing it again, and then building like ever gradual growing companies over time, and then build up wealth that way. And I that wasn't like the path that I envisioned for this company. Like, I'm more of the like, I want to build a solid company that will grow over time. Like, I wanted to be in this for the long run. And so the like, I don't know, maybe we just didn't get that in depth in those conversations. Like, I thought I had a really solid process for it, but it turned out it was not enough. And so you learn from those experiences. So I'm like very grateful that like I figured that out, and I'm very grateful that we hadn't signed all the like paperwork and everything, because I had incorporated really early on, and like that could have been super messy, but thankfully it wasn't. So it ended up working out, and I learned a lot from that process. And there's no hard feelings or anything, but you can feel like you have all the things in line, but there's always curveballs. And that's kind of, I think, the biggest lesson in entrepreneurship is that there's always something that's going to catch you off guard. And depending on how you respond to it is like, you know, is everything, I think. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of folks, especially when you look at capitalists reflecting on their founders and stuff, everyone's always like, oh, it's grit and it's perseverance, and I'm like, no, it's adaptability, right? Like, it's that ability to roll with every punch, because it's not like you're not going to have punches being thrown at you constantly, right? And so understanding how do you respond in that moment of change in order to assess what's going on and take the right next step and all that kind of stuff is, at least, you know I don't want to ascribe to every founder what the right thing is, but in my lived experience, right, like my adaptability has served me infinitely more than almost any other sort of emotional skill I have, right? Um, let's sort of you've been sort of laying out this sort of timeline and story, which I've deeply appreciated to sort of like calibrate of like, okay, where are you on this journey? You had sort of spent this time with co-founder dating and these co-founders that you were excited to potentially work with, but the timing of it had sort of seems like it had taken a while, and you were very present of like, oh, this economic window is closing, these interest rates, that's not a good sign, all this kind of stuff. You find this co-founder that you're feel really aligned to, and all this kind of stuff. Um, Tell me about that journey of going from that moment into, I presume, fundraising, because you've talked a lot about VCs and wanting to go and get funding. And so like, and this is sort of knowledge from our previous conversations. I know where you've ended up, and I'm eager to get to that part too. But so like, take me through that initial, like, okay, I have a co-founder, let's go. Next step is clearly fundraising, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was just kind of following the pattern that I'd seen other founders take. So um, when I was talking to Jason and we were trying to figure out, okay, whose IP are we going to do? We had a lot of conversations about like maybe we can combine them. Like, let's figure out whose idea we want to pursue. And then ultimately we decided, okay, we're not going to combine them. That's a lot of work. At this point in time, we're not entirely sure it would be the best call for either of our IPs. So we decided, since I had already put together a pitch deck for the project that I was initially pitching, and I had already done like budgets, forecasts, a very, very like super rough, high level like production roadmap for it, just to kind of like wrap my head around everything. And I had this really extensive deck that I, hoped covered all the different bases in the appendix, and went out. I was like, okay, we're just going to pitch this. Let's see what happens. I really feel like this window is closing. We might have actually even missed it, was the sense that I was getting. So we went out in, essentially it was like August of 2023. Wow. um, we had about 8 people, because I had been, talking to more than just co-founders. Because I would come across people that I'm like, okay, you don't really quite seem like co-founder material, but maybe, maybe you could be like lead or director or whatever. So I was talking to tons and tons of candidates like across all sorts of disciplines and just like networking and building connections. And so at that point we had a team of 8 that signed letters of intent to join, and including my co-founder. Like, he wasn't on the project full time at that point. Uh, it was just me. I was like the one, employee of the studio, and I went out pitching. It was literally just me, like taking the pitch deck and pitching to every VC. I mean, it was all the like usual suspects. I had already built up, like I said, I for years before had added a bunch of people in on LinkedIn, and it was pretty easy for me to reach out and just be like, hey, this is what we're doing. And at the time, we like, even during that point in time, we had Bruce Nesmith, the lead designer on Skyrim, working with us. We had this very, very impressive team that we'd put together. And so I was feeling pretty confident about it. I was like, oh, I know that's a bit shaky out there, but like, if we have a pretty good chance here. We went out and like started pitching the game, essentially got the resounding like, wow, the amount of money that you're trying to raise is like not going to happen. We overall like commend you on the great team that you've assembled. You have a really strong team, and the game concept's really interesting, but you're not going to raise that much money in this climate. So by like mid-November, we were like, oh crap, okay, like, I guess it was probably like early November, we realized, all right, there is no way that we're going to like keep pitching the game in this capacity. So we can either try to like scope this game down, or we can pivot to your game concept. And so we started talking about what that would look like, and we ultimately decided, let's pitch your game, since it's like significantly smaller in scope. So we went out there and, or I say we, like I went out, we like essentially just started cramming, trying to get all the pitch materials and everything put together. And, prototyping a bunch of stuff. So we had a prototype that we took out to DICE in 2023. And we were full on pitching the game basically early 2023, all the way up until like May. So our experience was just like essentially kind of getting the runaround from VCs. We would get like, they'd give us little like homework assignments. So, which I knew from reading a lot of books about venture capital and just, being in a lot of those circles like on LinkedIn. And like, I understood that this is essentially no, but there could be, and we could hit a certain maybe like hit a critical point where we've done enough of the things, we've checked enough of the boxes that they'll be like, okay, yes, that was kind of the hope there. So, first it was, we want to see your monetization team built out. There was a lot of pressure to try to like make our game a free to play game. And that wasn't originally the vision. And so, but we were like, all right, well, let's like, we feel like there's some flexibility in this and we could come up with some clever like business cases uh, for the game. So like, and I had already been talking to some monetization folks at the time. So we actually ended up bringing on one of the senior systems designer who basically built the battle pass for Fortnite. And he was bootstrapping with us for a few months. And I was like, okay, got your monetization person right here. And they were like, oh, wow, okay. They kept being pretty impressed with the team that we were putting together. But then, then it turned into, well, we want to see market validation research. And so we ended up working with Quantic Foundry to do some market research. And we had a lot of like feelings on our like go to market and our like different segments of our audience. And like we understood it pretty well, but it was all just a hunch because we didn't have a game that we could point to that said like, this is a very similar game and this is a successful game. So therefore ours will be, we were like saying this doesn't exist in the market and it's like aesthetically very different too. So like, I think VCs were very like uneasy about the whole thing. So they're like, we want to see data. The data, like we were happy with the data. It supported our gut feeling on it. So we're like, here it is, and we present that. And then they just landed on, we want to see product market fit. And we were just like, wow, okay, well, okay, that is clearly just like a no. And, I took the signals there and I was like, we need to pivot. And so that was kind of the moment. This was like in, what was it? Late May. I guess I went to, what was the conference I went to in May? It was, I don't know, yeah, like GamesBeat. Yeah, it was GamesBeat. I think I had the aha moment then where I was like, okay, no one is getting funding. VCs are not funding content right now. We need to pivot. So I came back from that conference and told the team, like, okay, we're pivoting. We've got X amount of time for a personal runway. Let's just go hard on trying to take what was always intended to be an internal like investor demo and make it ready to show to the public and just see if there's a need for this game. So we spent several months uh, essentially getting the game to a place where we felt like we could show a gameplay trailer for it. And yeah, and then we announced in August. So that was kind of our journey from like trying to, very aggressively trying. I mean, I've had multiple meetings with many of the VCs, like, in some cases, like 4 or 5 meetings, trying really hard to get venture capital. And it just wasn't in the cards for us as it is, as we know for many, many founders. I'm just glad that we decided to pivot when we did because we could have been spinning our wheels and wasting all of our resources and essentially no longer be in operation right now. So yeah, it's kind of crazy to think about.
Yep. So you bootstrap into making a gameplay trailer. You go live with that announcement, um, uh, and are you continuing to bootstrap from August last year to now? And like, what is that sort of? How has your thinking evolved around fundraising, and what is the path you're pursuing now? Like, in whatever detail you feel comfortable sharing. Just curious how that has sort of evolved since that moment, because I think it was absolutely, to your point, very uh thoughtful of you to be like, okay, here are the signals, here's the signals in the industry, let's go for this thing. And it means changing our strategy drastically, but this is maybe getting us the success we want. Now, what have you learned sort of from that pivot, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was that very critical time between June, and at that point we had runway up until like, I mean, it was basically at the end of like September into October. And so that was a pretty scary time for us. We were essentially faced with the reality that we needed um, at least a month and a half to get the gameplay trailer out there to show it off to the public. And then we needed about a month. I say we needed way more time than that, but like we had about a month to build up an audience as quickly as possible, going from like not even having announced the company, right? Like we were announcing the company and the game all at once. And then essentially after that month, we would launch the Kickstarter, and then, you know, the Kickstarter would go for about 30 days. And then, you know, hopefully from that point, we would have money in the bank. And so that was just absolutely terrifying. Fortunately, we ended up securing a couple small checks. Um, Funny enough, from our very first investor was one of my neighbors, and I've had, you know, conversations with this couple probably about 6 months prior to, you know, them actually giving us the funding, and they were really excited about what we were doing. And you know, it was honestly like the timing of it couldn't have been better. And then from there, another, you know, then we ended up getting two more investors, and honestly, it's like friends and family essentially. And then there was another developer from Riot that invested as well. And so we, you know, we were able to like postpone the Kickstarter and push it out a little bit. Like we knew we still wanted to do the Kickstarter and stay the course with the bootstrapping plan, because I mean, in some weird way, like as soon as we decided we're not fundraising anymore, we got really like fired up about it, and like our velocity of like getting stuff done like just kind of shot through the roof, which was crazy. And it really felt like we were just kind of like, all right, it's it's now or never. We just need to like stay focused on building the game, building the audience. And it was kind of like taking destiny into our own hands. And once the announcement did well, and it took off and went viral, we had a bunch of inbound from publishers. Surprisingly, like not as many of the like venture capitalists had reached out that we had already been having conversations with. But we had already had it in our head, like, all right, let's just stay the course with bootstrapping and push towards the Kickstarter, because that'll allow us to continue building our community. We always wanted to build the game in coordination with our community, so that'll like really kind of jumpstart that. And then hopefully, I mean, our hope with this is that that'll put us a little further out when we actually start having conversations with publishers and you know, just funders more broadly. Hopefully, the climate will be a little bit better. And so that's kind of our thinking with that. Like, we really just want to take the opportunity to focus on what is really most important, if, you know, as developers, like making the game and finding the audience that's really passionate about the game. So our early adopters are like really, really there for us. And we, you know, it feels like when we get the game out there, it resonates with a lot of individuals. So we feel very confident in our ability to pull, you know, this like immediate milestone off with the Kickstarter. So we're just staying the course with that.
That's awesome. A lot of that journey, like no part of that journey doesn't sound uh terrifying and uncomfortable in many ways, right? Like as a founder, deep wells of empathy um for all of those moments. But I think, you know, when we think about part of the reason why I do this podcast is, you know, so other founders or potential founders can sort of learn as much as they can. And I think one of the things I really appreciate about the path that you've ended up walking is you've navigated, okay, my reality is venture funding, okay, now my reality is bootstrapping, and seeing the difference and sort of living into that. You know, when you reflect across that experience, talking to a potential founder or talking to someone who's just starting that journey, what would you share as like, hey, here's the hard won lesson that I've at least come to, or here's my perspective on this thing, and any tips or mindset or like reflections that you think would be worth sharing on that journey?
You mean specifically to the fundraising
The
or
fundraising piece,
overall?
yeah, the fundraising piece.
Oof. That is a very good question. I feel like, I mean, looking back on it, I like if I could go back and change any part of the journey, I'm not sure it would have changed the outcome for us. Um, but I feel like it would have helped, like through that journey of like talking to investors and doing the pitch over and over again, it really helped us like take the vision and find a way to like convey it more succinctly, which is very, very, very important for the Kickstarter. So I, yeah, I can't, I mean, I don't, the lessons learned, I mean, there were so many lessons learned throughout that process. Um, I mean, if I could really go back and change things, I would, knowing everything that I know now, I would have never tried to fundraise with venture capital and strategics in the first place. I would have just like stayed heads down building the game and making more progress there instead of like spending time and resources like in, endless calls basically. But, if the climate had been different, um, yeah, it's a really good question about like what, if it had been in the heyday. And I think maybe timing, like I probably wasn't that great at trying to like collect all of the different investors and then do a big push all at once to kind of create, potential hype around what we're doing. I mean, it was near impossible to do that in the current climate. But like, if you are a startup that has something that is showing potential and like investors are excited about it, like I kind of trickled it out, which talked to some here and some here, and it was like over the span of many months, as opposed to kind of like a giant blast all at once, because you really want to try to like create that sense of um, FOMO and hype. It's really hard to like. You have to have a good proposition in the first place. Like, and even if you do have a good proposition, it may not be immediately noticed. I mean, we hear this story all the time in venture capital, where like, investors miss the one that like blows up, and that story happens all the time. But I feel like if I were to go back and do this process again, I would probably try to coordinate it a little bit better. I certainly, I was learning, and like as I had more conversations with people, I'd learn about more connections. And now that I feel like I'm significantly more well connected, I guess it's kind of a it feels weird to say that, but like I feel like I know enough investors now at this point that it'll be much easier to execute that on that later if we ever want to.
Yeah, for sure. I want to switch sort of focus of the topic to sort of less of the journey so far and more focusing in on you as a founder on this journey, right? Like in you and your relationship to the work and everything else going on. And specifically, I think where I'd love to double click on is um, thinking about yourself on this founding journey, and where and areas of the founding journey and uh, the emotional navigation of it. Like, where do you feel like you have a lot of support as a founder, and you feel really confident in navigating the space as a founder, even when unexpected things happen? You feel like, oh, this is a place as a founder I feel comfortable navigating. And where do you sort of feel like, oh, I'm struggling to navigate this as a founder because I don't have the support or I don't have the knowledge or whatever? Like, what are those kind of components? Especially, I think you're a founder who comes from a very different background than many of the other founders I've talked to so far. So I'd really love to understand, where you end up seeing yourself on that spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, my spouse being able to like directly and financially support me, as I haven't been making, like for over 2 years, I wasn't making income. So that's obviously like first and foremost. I have to like shout shout out to my wife, because it certainly wouldn't be possible otherwise. Uh, just kind of along the journey, I've met other founders. I've met other people that have gone through the journey of starting a company, and varying levels of either it going well or not going well. Being able to hear those stories and kind of gut check your own strategies and feelings on things, to just to get that extra bit of like, okay, yeah, maybe we are on the right path. Nobody ever really knows, but you kind of just have to go through gut a lot of the times. But there's always that voice in the back of your head that's like, is this the right call? Like, being able to just kind of gut check that is always nice. Um, I've built up a lot of connections over the years where, you have to kind of not be scared to reach out to people and ask for advice. Like, hey, would you be willing to jump on a call? I mean, I literally just did that yesterday with a founder that I had admired for quite a while and just never really reached out to. And they self published their game, and I wanted to kind of like poke them on that and see what that journey was like, and see if if we had uh, the resolve to do it, or resolve, and just kind of strategically trying to plan that out. And so we're really trying to consider all of our potential pathways, and then just trying to find people that have navigated that, and try to like talk to them and understand their journey a little bit better to try to plan for it. But um, yeah, I would have to say honestly, it's other founders.
When you think about sort of where you're at now, both on your journey, but as a founder, and what you feel like you have lived in experience versus sort of what you said of the like, you read it in a book or you read it in an article or you hear it on a podcast experience, right? What sort of support structures? I mean, I guess we're recording this at kind of at the beginning of the year, so we could sort of frame it as like, what's your New Year's goal of, building support structures for yourself as a founder, especially thinking about what 2025 is going to be for your founding journey, where you're like, I need to build more support here or there, right?
Yeah, I for me it's just trying to think about where we currently are, where we want to go, and try to just be in contact with individuals that have walked that journey and have like direct experience and tangible advice that they can give you throughout those periods. And whether it be mentors or someone that you could potentially work towards in a more official advisory capacity, just trying to set those relationships up for when you get to that point. And I feel like I'm always trying to think ahead like that. um, More directly in our current, like for this year, for the first half of this year, getting in touch with people that really deeply understand Kickstarter and Kickstarter communities, and just kind of community strategies around that. So that's been a big focus for us currently. And then honestly, like some of my favorite parts of this are like just engaging with our direct community and content creators that are excited about what we're doing, and just kind of like collaborating with them to come up with ideas on stuff. And that it kind of like, it's like, oh, that's a whole another area that like I don't admittedly I'm not like a huge Twitch streamer. I'm not really big into like Twitch stream culture, and I've been getting involved in it in the last like year and a half, just to like understand it more and immerse myself. And the more I get involved in it, I'm like, this is actually kind of great. Like I love the little communities that pop up. And I mean, admittedly, when Twitch first came out, I felt like that old person that was like, I don't get it. Why would people want to watch people play video games? Like I'd rather play the video game. So for the longest time, I just like didn't personally get it until lately. I've been involved in various communities that have similar interests, and it just feels like, oh, we found our people. Like I mean, that was a big struggle for us, like just just trying to find other people that understood what we were trying to do and like cared about it, from the project standpoint. So there's all, obviously all the business side of things that feels very foreign, but like you're kind of navigating it one way, but the other side of it with like the community part of that was like another area of support that was like very, very unexpected. Like I was not expecting to get this level of like emotional support kind of from our community. So that's kind of another angle about that I think will help us push forward in our goals for our Kickstarter and community, and obviously like longer term promoting the game.
For sure. That's yeah. I think it's always something that I've always appreciated about the game studio founders that I talk to is that community of finding the people that you're ostensibly making the game for ends up being that big support structure in a lot of ways. especially early on when you like first find those first players and they're like super excited, you know. Yeah. So, all right. We're wrapping up. I have two components. One is the entirely unfair question that I ask everyone, and then is the introspection lightning round, which is just a quick deep dive into some of the questions that I asked during my own co-founder dating, and we'll get through those pretty quick. But the first, the unfair question: given the experience thus far, you know, and this is deeply unfair in a variety of ways, but it also means you have to sort of put yourself outside of your current context and think some indeterminate time in the future, your current venture has maybe gone well, maybe not gone well, who knows. Would you ever go through this idea of a founding journey again?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, whether I could like convince my wife to go along with it again is another question. But I feel like I personally, um, I've enjoyed I've enjoyed the entire ride, even though it's had its like ups and downs. The downs have been pretty pretty down, but overall, I enjoy the challenge of it. I love learning. I love meeting new people. I love working with like really passionate people, and I feel like we've been very fortunate to find that group. Like we, you know, like a lot of the team that we pulled together, they're not in it for the money right now because like we, like, you know, we don't really have those resources. So they're there because they believe in the project and the like grander vision for the studio, and so um, I mean, for me, that's what makes it all worth it. Honestly, it's really weird when I jumped off in the very very beginning and it was just me. My biggest fear was like, oh man, it's like I feel like I'm probably gonna get emotional about this because my biggest fear was like, what if I can't find anybody to join me? Like, what if I like take this big leap and like literally no one wants to join me on it? That was like my biggest fear, and so when I like that to me was like my kind of I don't know benchmark of success, being able to find people that wanted to do this with me, and I mean I guess I can say that I'm successful in that. And so if this doesn't, you know, if there's a world in which this fails, um, I can look back on it and be like, wow, I accomplished what I wanted to accomplish, which was like building a great team and a great studio culture and like something that people were passionate about. Um, and so I would take that with me, and then everything I've learned, you know, into the next, you know, whatever that is in the future to hopefully do it better the next time. So, yeah, I personally have loved the journey and would absolutely do it again if, you know, my spouse would tolerate it.
Well, on the plus side, it would be hard for the market conditions to be any worse next time. So,
I mean, it can always be worse, but like, let's hope not.
yeah,
Oh
exactly.
man.
All right. So, introspection lightning round. For context, these are a series of questions that I would basically usually give the people that I was talking to about co-founding a lot more time to answer, but you're going to get the unfair version. But they're basically like a groundwork for our first conversation in the sort of co-founder dating experience. They stem from a dear friend of mine who is currently my COO. I'm not sure why she signed up for it, but she sort of had this insight when we worked together at a company a while back that the strengths and weaknesses of a company are ultimately the strengths and weaknesses of its founders, right? And so I sort of took that to heart, and it formed the basis of like, okay, if I'm going to co-found it with someone, to your earlier point, like there's values and other things that we need to work through and talk through. But at the start of it, let's at least understand what are going to be the strengths of our eventual company and what are going to be the weaknesses, and can we look those in the eye and like those. So we'll start with the first one, which is, what is your superpower?
Yeah, I would say that's probably my persistence. I've always been very like, you know, when I kind of set my mind to something, I'm going to push forward with it. I think that's gotten me through a lot of the like really intense challenges I've experienced personally, like throughout my life and through the like, you know, this founding journey. Um, and then obviously kind of all the like business challenges. So you have to have like thick skin and not take things personally and just like don't get too caught up in your own brain about stuff and just keep pushing forward. So yeah, I'd say persistence.
Awesome. Outside of your superpower, what are your biggest strengths?
I This is surprising because I didn't realize this about myself until I started doing this. But I really enjoy the business development aspect. Like I enjoy talking to people. I enjoy meeting people and like understanding them better and like what are the things that interest them and drive them to do what they do. So yeah, I feel like the whether I'm good at it, I don't really know, but I feel like I enjoy it and it feels like it's something I can do at least pretty you know well enough to move things forward with this business. But yeah.
Awesome. I would love to borrow your superpower or your strength at some point because it is not one of mine. What are your big weaknesses?
Uh, um, oh man, but yeah, this one, if I'm being like completely honest, it's I have recently gone through the process of like, I mean, I've always known I've had suspected that I've had ADHD, um, and so I've gone through that journey of like figuring that out and getting medicated and all that. So like, I would have to say the thing that I constantly am like orienting and trying to like be aware of and focus on is like the like prioritize like what is the highest priority thing, staying focused on that and constantly pressing forward on that. That is like something I like continuously have to like push against and like try to like specifically make that a focus. So yeah, just prioritizing and staying focused on the highest priority things, I would say, is like a weakness, something I definitely wish I could do significantly better. I think I'm gradually getting better at it, but I in a lot of ways I have to just kind of embrace that messiness of it because it feels like oftentimes there are like 100 things that are like pressing, and trying to like determine what literally is the most important thing is not easy, but like trying to be aware of that and staying focused on it, I think is important. So
What are your stress reactions?
stress reactions. You mean like I'm like having a hard time and I'm like, how does my body
Uh,
react or how do I
no,
respond to it?
yeah. So this specifically comes from the idea that like, hey, when you're inside a startup, oftentimes you are in stress, right? Like it's a stressful time as it turns out. And so how do you respond to the stress? And some of it can be physical for sure, right? Like a dear friend of mine, when he gets into super deep prolonged periods of stress, he gets walking pneumonia. It just like clockwork, it just happens. But what I really mean is more like, how is this going to shape how you interact with your team? How is this going to shape when you interact with your co-founders, right? Like, I've talked to folks who, their stress reaction is a need for control, right? They feel out of control, and so they become very controlling people, even if that's not normally how they are, right? I've met other people who are like, oh, to your prioritization thing, they're like, their stress reaction is they no longer can prioritize. They just lose all capacity to do it, and all sorts of things in between. But like, how does your interpersonal skills change as a stress reaction?
That's a really good question. Well, for me, because of that ADHD side of things, like especially unmedicated, there's the tendency to like something that's really hard or really stressful or really challenging. I have a tendency to like procrastinate, but I will say I'm very good. And I've always been this way of like working under pressure. So it's like I'll like in that nebulous space of like trying to figure the things out and prioritize and all that, like when it absolutely becomes like, okay, now it's like it has to happen. Um, I, in that moment, it's weird. It's like my body can all of a sudden be like, focus and just get it done. And so I'm like really good at working under pressure. It's not great. That's not a healthy way to like do that, obviously, because it has trickle down impacts on the team. Because if I'm like, if I know there's like 12 things I need to do and this one's like really important, I'm like, oh, I don't really want to do that one. I keep like waiting on it and then like kind of pull the trigger a little bit later on it. Um, it's like, yeah, it's just, it's not really a great way to like handle that. I have find that the medication is helping with that process quite a bit, but yeah, I feel like I'm a little bit of both of those. It's like I like have a hard time prioritizing or like making the like taking the actions. Like I've already decided like this is what we're doing, but then like to go and do it, it's like okay, there's all these other things I want to do. And they're like the things that I want to do, so I'll like focus on those, even though it's not the most like high priority thing. But then as soon as I like snap back to like this actually needs to get done, I'm like super lightning fast, like focus on it and push through it.
So the last one, which I always need to explain, which is fine, is what are your upkeep needs? And what I specifically mean by that, like, what are the things that need to happen in your work setting on a regular basis that keep you sane? And the example I always use, which is my upkeep need, if I do work and no one acknowledges or responds to it, like I start to go insane. So like if I do an Excel sheet that is meant to help like here, let's help budget the game and no one engages with it or no one sort of says, "Oh yeah, I looked at it and that works." I'm like I start vibrating. And I need to know that okay, I did a thing and it was useful because otherwise I spin into the like, well, did I just waste my time? Is that not useful? How do I change it to be useful? Like, and it just starts uh, making Carl go insane. And so I frame that as, hey, I need this upkeep need of like, if I do work, you need to at least say, yes, I looked at it. Otherwise, I will spin out. And so that sort of like upkeep need of regular thing that happens at work that keeps you as close to healthy and productive as you can be given whatever situation.
Yeah, for me, I feel like it's just like having those really high level collaborative, like exciting strategy calls. You know, it's like I'll be in my own head for, you know, weeks, depending on like what it is and what stage we're at, whatever. Like I will be in my head about a particular thing that might be 3 months out or whatever. And like I'm not exposing my co-founder to all of the things that need to happen for that like big thing that needs to happen until I need, you know, something from him that like moves that forward. And so uh, keeping all that in my own head and then finally like, you know, getting to a point where we like sit down and have a conversation like, okay, here, let me map out all the stuff that I've been like thinking about. Um, and then getting his input on it and that kind of like creative, like marrying business and creative and like all the kind of marketing stuff around that is like exciting and kind of like invigorates me where it's like okay, all the stuff I've been thinking about uh, it feels like it starts to kind of like go in motion when I like bring my co-founder into it and kind of work through the ideas and almost like in a way kind of validate them and be like all right do you feel like this is enough, do you think it's too much, do you think, you know, like realistically can we fit this in with the schedule of all the stuff that you're doing. And when it comes together and we're like yeah it feels like that's the path forward, it's like you know it feels good to be like all right moving forward and we just like press on that. So for me it's just that like collaborative strategic brainstorming and like kind of bringing it all together and mapping it out. So
Well, thank you so much for spending the time to go through all of my wild questions and share your journey with us.
yeah, no problem, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, is there anything you wanted to share with listeners? Any shout outs? Anything you want to hype or shill or anything like that?
Yeah, of course, thanks. We are preparing for our Kickstarter. We recently soft launched the coming soon page. So we haven't done any like major promotional pushes for that yet, but we've got a bunch in store that we're working towards. So we're looking at doing our Kickstarter in the spring of this year, and so you can right now go on, you know, essentially you can just Google Hawthorn. It's with no e, Kickstarter, and it'll be one of the first results that pop up. And if you go and just follow, I think the button says like notify on launch or something like that. You know, essentially follow the Kickstarter. You'll get an email when it launches, and um, you know, share that with your friends and community if you feel like the game resonates with you. We're really excited about building this like in coordination uh, with other other creatives, other people that are excited about this kind of world. And um, our whole thing is wanting to really bring the creative process and focus back into games, because I feel like we've kind of gone through this 10-year period of just like, figuring out the formula of something that like resonate, that we, business people think will resonate with gaming communities, and that's, and then we've been chasing that as a AAA like industry for a long time, and I'm kind of excited about the like all the indie teams that have spun up, because I feel like we're going to see some truly innovative stuff come out in the next couple of years, and our hope is we can kind of be a part of that movement of like bringing the creative focus back into games and like letting that really stand on its own and shine.
Awesome. And then finally, before we close out, if someone heard about stuff on this podcast of your journey or anything like that and wanted to sort of, as you did, reach out to a founder that they respect or they want to know more, what is the best way for them to get in touch with you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. You can also reach me at Cerlan at NEARstudios.com. And yeah, I feel like those are probably the two best places to reach out from a professional standpoint.
Amazing. Well, thank you again for coming on, and best of luck with your Kickstarter.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to the entire episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends or anyone you think could benefit from it, and leave us a positive rating or subscribe. This episode was edited by Christopher Delano, music by Jake Hall, who's available for composer work in games. And if you're interested in learning more about the Game Founders support community, go to gamefounders.org or email me at carl@gamefounders.org. Thanks so much.